Hi, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental topics that green up our world. Today we'll be talking about unnecessary idling, and I'm not referring to the idling done by couch potatoes, but rather by internal combustion engines, whether they be transportation vehicles, construction equipment, or even small motors used in lawnmowers. We're lucky enough to have two experts on this topic, one from the sphere of human health and the other from the world of engine technologies. Our first guest is Dr. Sara Adar, the John Searle Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Dr. Adar, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're so glad you could be here. First off, let's get into what is your research?
Absolutely. So I study how air pollution affects our heart and lungs, and I have a special interest on understanding the health impacts of motor vehicles.
Great. And what is it about the emissions of motor vehicles that impacts our health? Or let's say what components, what's in it?
So there are many different things that are inside motor vehicle emissions. They make lots of different things. The ones that we worry about especially are these things that are very, very small particles in the air, really at the fraction of the width of a human hair. And the reason that we worry a lot about those is because they can get very, very deep into our, into our lungs and therefore cause health problems. There are also gases in traffic that are of concern, like nitrogen dioxide, as well as some compounds that are known to cause cancer.
The little particles, are those called particulate matter?
That's exactly right, yeah. So they're commonly referred to as particulate matter.
Okay. And before you mentioned that some of them are irritants, and does that mean that if somebody had a pre-existing condition, like say they had asthma or emphysema, that it would make it worse to be near idling vehicles?
Yeah, absolutely. So these particles and gases can actually bother anyone's lungs and cause, difficulty breathing and things like that. But especially, we worry about people who have asthma or, as you say, COPD and some of these respiratory conditions that predispose them to that irritation.
Well, I know asthma is a big concern all over the country. I guess it's increasing. The rate is increasing?
That's right. It is increasing over time.
And especially here in Washington County, because I guess our rates here are higher than they are elsewhere in Michigan and in the U.S. in general. So how is it that asthma is affected by auto emissions?
Auto emissions actually can cause things like wheezing, and the need to take inhalers, so shortness of breath among asthmatics. So it can basically exacerbate their asthma or make it worse. There's actually evidence as well that, children who live next to large freeways or attend schools that are also right up against highways can actually be more likely to even develop asthma. So there's both the, bothering of the people who already have it, as well as perhaps, the development among new children.
And what about things like heart disease? You mentioned that's part of your research.
Right, yeah, so heart disease is another really big topic for this. We know that we can see increases in things like heart attacks and strokes. You can actually see long-term the development of atherosclerosis, so the thickening of people's arteries over time when they live next to freeways.
Sounds awful. So what about cancer?
The Environmental Protection Agency, has looked at many different studies, mostly from workers, so people, like who drive trucks and, work in truck loading docks, as well as miners who are exposed to a lot of diesel emissions. And they've come to the conclusion that diesel is a likely human carcinogen.
What is it in diesel that makes it different from other vehicles?
And this might be an excellent question for your next guest as well, but, diesel emissions, they just have different profiles. Often the particles are much, much smaller. They can have different, species or chemicals on those particles. So it's not just, a pure, clean particle that comes out, but you actually get a lot of these nasty chemicals that sorb onto those particles.
Interesting. And why are children a particular concern when it comes to idling emissions?
So, there's a couple reasons. One is that children actually breathe in a lot more air for their body size as compared to humans, sorry, of course, children.
Big humans.
Big humans, yes, as adults. So they get a much larger dose. Of course, they're also still growing and developing, and so their lungs, and their bodies are more susceptible. For idling in particular, children are also riding school buses often, and it's been estimated about 30% of the fleet right now in the United States are still driving these older buses that don't have clean air technologies on them.
When you say older buses, when did the clean air technology get instituted in our buses?
It's a great question. So for a long time now, the engine manufacturers have been working to try and reduce emissions, coming off of their engines. The cleanest of all the vehicles now have been since 2007. They've made really dramatic improvements in what comes off of their engines since then. So those are quite clean. Between about 1998 and 2006, they were phasing in different technologies as they figured out what was going to work best. So it's a bit of a time growth where they've been getting cleaner and cleaner, but certainly after 2007 they're quite clean now.
So I assume the EPA is hoping that if possible we can replace the old buses, but if the school district can't afford it, are there retrofits that they can do to fix the old ones?
There's a big campaign by the Environmental Protection Agency actually to try and provide funds to different counties and school districts so that they can try and retrofit their buses. And what that means is you take an older bus and you install these cleaner technologies onto those buses to try and reduce emissions.
Great. And are there, say they don't have money for that either, or in addition, can they change how they drive? Can the drivers change how they do things to help the kids so they're not breathing so much of it?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, so this talk today especially is about idling, and that's one really easy way in which we can try and reduce exposures, to children in buses, also people waiting on the sidewalks for those buses. I mean, it goes out throughout the whole community, so even around truck stops and things like that. And the idea is basically that, if you're not moving, and you're able to turn off that engine, that really does help protect the environment and people surrounding, the vehicles.
A lot of times you'll see buses waiting for kids. Either they're waiting for the kids to board to leave for the day, or they're at a field trip or a sporting event or something, and you'll see the driver sitting in the empty bus idling. So is that what you mean? Turn it off.
That's exactly what I mean. So turn it off, as you're waiting for the kids, either at the school or at a field trip. Same thing goes for delivery trucks. If you have trucks coming in to make deliveries, at schools or elsewhere, turning off those vehicles when you're not using them would be great.
Before the show, you mentioned that sometimes the intake to the school is near the loading dock, so the kids are getting the emissions from the vehicles?
So we certainly know that pollution outside can come into our indoor environments. That can certainly happen if you have, say, all the windows open right next to where the buses are idling. But it can also happen that if you have an air intake right next to your loading dock, as actually my old workplace had, sometimes you can even smell those emissions inside the building.
And in terms of behaviors, there's probably some things that could happen on the school level, such as, I'm thinking about the poor drivers that, we're saying turn off the engine and they're getting cold in the winter, or they're hot in the summer. So maybe the schools could invite the drivers into a place inside the school so they could be more comfortable?
One of the big roadblocks in having drivers turn off their engines, is comfort and getting the bus ready or getting their truck ready, or just spending time in it and making it comfortable. So there's several different options. I mean, I think you listed very good ones of being able to have another place with shelter or heat. They actually also have these auxiliary power units now and heaters that they can install inside their buses or trucks that really use a lot less fuel and create less emissions, that allow them to both have the comfort but not necessarily have the entire bus idling for hours at a time.
That's great. And putting in a plug for planting trees and putting benches around the schoolyard so parents too have a place to sit outside their car.
I was a bus driver and waiting for the kids, having a nice shaded area would be perfect.
And there's a lot of things going on around the country, and you mentioned a couple before the show. Can you tell me some of the advances in terms of getting people to turn off their engines?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different campaigns around the country. I mean, it ranges from everything from, bumper stickers that buses put on their cars, or, the back of their bus that says, I don't believe in idling, to, I think there's really fascinating things that have gone on around some of the border crossings. So when you think about, cars trying to get through customs between, say, the United States and Canada, you often can have these very long backups. And so they've done some really interesting regulations, say at the Peace Arch over between Vancouver and Seattle, where they have cars stop at traffic lights, and then they'll have everyone turn off their engines to prevent the idling. And then once the border agents are freed up, they have a bunch of cars move, but you don't have everyone idling for the several hours it can take to cross the border.
Makes total sense.
It does.
So where can people find out more information about this?
So there's a lot of excellent resources online. The Environmental Protection Agency has some really good ones. There's the Clean School Bus campaign that they have on their website, and I think you guys are going to have a link to that.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's epa.gov/clean school bus.
Yeah.
It's a mouthful.
It is.
Okay, great. Well, Dr. Adar, thank you so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I had a really nice time being here.
Great. By saving money and minimizing negative impacts on our health, reducing unnecessary idling appears to be a win-win. Why is it so hard to change our ways then? One reason is that there are many myths leading to habits that have become firmly entrenched and are hard to shake. In our next segment, we're going to explore some of these myths. Take a look.
Idling is sometimes unavoidable, like when we're stopped at traffic lights, but a lot of the idling we do is unnecessary.
Here's some common myths about idling, followed by the facts.
Engine idling myths and facts. This doesn't concern me.
The average person idles for 5 to 10 minutes each day, emitting harmful pollutants that are directly inhaled by people nearby. These pollutants include carbon monoxide and particulates, as well as toxic chemicals such as benzene. And idling uses 4% of U.S. oil, amounting to over $20 billion every year.
Here's the myth.
It takes more gas to turn your engine on and off than it does to leave it idling.
Here's the fact.
Modern engines do not take any significant gas to start, whereas when you're idling, you're using gas continuously.
So please just turn it off.
I shut my truck off every time I get out, even if it's going to be for a minute, because gas is expensive.
Here's another common myth.
Warming up the car is smart. It's good for the engine.
And here's the fact.
Warming up your car before driving is not a good idea. It causes a lot of extra wear in your engine and wastes gas.
U.S. Department of Energy research shows that driving off versus idling causes a lot less air pollution. So I bundle up, start, and go.
Here's the myth.
When I'm waiting, I have no choice.
And here's the fact.
I adjust for the weather so I don't have to run the engine constantly, and then I time it so that I don't get here early. And we carpool with the neighbors, so that's less cars that have to wait.
If it looks like I'm going to be in line for a while, I turn the car off. No need to idle constantly to keep the temperature comfortable.
Here's the myth.
Trucks and buses have to idle to keep the heat or air conditioning running.
And here's the fact.
Here at the University of Michigan, we've installed supplemental heaters on our buses to avoid idling and still be able to maintain comfortable temperatures in the buses.
Here's another common myth.
It's okay to idle as long as it's not cars and trucks.
But the fact is,
most small engines are air-cooled. Sitting idle causes the engines to overheat, which produces undue wear on the engine, which also will raise emissions.
Removing fuel at the end of the season is best done with a siphon pump similar to this one. You put one end of this into the fuel tank and the other end into a storage container, and you pump this to remove the fuel. That way you don't have to run it until it runs out of gasoline.
Here's the myth.
Idling has nothing to do with climate change.
And here's the fact.
Idling in the U.S. produces approximately 100 billion pounds of CO2 each year.
And this myth, last but not least.
Idling is not a public health issue.
But unfortunately, the fact is,
due to their young age and developing bodies, children are particularly vulnerable to air pollution.
like smoking cigarettes, idling hurts not only you, but others around you.
Can you please turn the car off?
Oh,
So just turn it off.
You may recognize our next guest as the expert in the video you just watched. He is John German, an engineer and senior fellow with the International Council on Clean Transportation, based in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show. We're so glad you could be here today.
Glad to be here.
So what is the ICCT and what do you do there?
We work with vehicle emissions and pollutant emissions worldwide, including developing countries. I am their vehicle technology expert. I've had stints in the past with both Honda and Chrysler.
Okay, great. So the myths that were in this video, a lot of them I'm assuming were based on fact at one point in time, but they're not relevant anymore because of new technologies. So could you just tell us some of those new technologies and why we should be changing our behaviors?
Right. Back in the days when vehicles had carburetors and they had mechanical controls of the carburetors, the vehicles were genuinely difficult to start. And even when they were hot on a restart, you could wind up cranking it over a few times, which is fuel used, and that fuel is a pollutant. And so people, I think, are still kind of stuck in that paradigm. But what's happened is that with modern fuel injection systems and with computer controls that know exactly how much fuel to inject and inject it precisely at the right time, engines now restart very quickly, very rapidly, with almost no fuel consumption, with almost no wear on the starter or the battery.
Great.
Even at cold temperatures, it used to be that you could damage the engine if you drove off right away. But the oils, the engine oils that are used in vehicles these days are so much better. They provide more than adequate lubrication, even at a cold start on a cold day. So all the old reasons why you needed to idle just really don't exist anymore.
And when did these technologies come about?
Carburetors started phasing out in the late 70s and were completely gone by 1990. The computer controls were well in place by then. So if you have a vehicle that's less than 25, 30 years old, you're fine.
Great. Hopefully most of the cars on the road are like that these days.
Yes.
So in the movie they show waiting in line at a fast food restaurant, and I know for banks, drive-thrus, there's a lot of stopping and starting. So you mentioned this, the new electronic ignitions. Does that mean that we can turn our engine on and off and not damage it, even if it's just for a short time?
Right. There's no problem with the oiling, short stops. It's so easy to start the engine that there's not much wear and tear on the engine or the starter or the battery. And it doesn't even take much fuel. If you can shut your engine off for even 10 or 15 seconds, that will save more fuel than it takes to restart the engine. And if you're in a drive-through line, I should also say that the best thing to do is park your car and go in and order. Don't even sit in the drive-through.
So a lot of these things are behavior changes.
Yes.
Okay. And inside the vehicle, could you be breathing things in if you're waiting in line behind somebody?
Yes. There's always some pollutants in the exhaust of any vehicle. And the real problem with idling is what we call proximity emissions. It's actually directly breathing carbon monoxide, benzene from gasoline vehicles, particulates from diesel vehicles. And the closer you are to it, the worse it is.
Maybe that's why kids are particularly vulnerable, because they're shorter and closer to the tailpipes.
They are closer to the tailpipes, but the other problem with children is that their lungs are still developing, and they're much more easily damaged than adults are.
Scary. So what's the rule of thumb in terms of timing? I've heard on the EPA website it says 3 to 5 minutes for turning off a school bus, but what about passenger cars?
Yeah, passenger cars, if you pretty sure you'll be idling for even 15 or 20 seconds, you're better off shutting the engine off.
That's short.
Yeah,
15
you'll
or
save
20
fuel,
seconds.
and you won't do any damage to the engine.
Well, the remote starters, what are those and how do you feel about those?
The remote starters, people use that for convenience so that the vehicle is already warmed up on a cold day, or is the air conditioning's on, cooled down on a hot day. The problem with them is that you're really wasting a lot of gasoline. If there are anybody in the vicinity, they are breathing that exhaust unnecessarily. And it's not really good for the engines either, because when you're just idling, the engines don't really get that hot, and you have some condensation from a cold engine when it started, and it takes a long time for that condensation to go away if you just idle. It's not good for the engine, it's not good for the exhaust system.
I guess you got to bundle up before you get in the car.
Right.
So driving off gently, that's something that a lot of people have mentioned to me, that when the car's cold, it's okay to start it right away, but don't gun it. What's that all about?
Right. Yes, you can drive off right away. That the oil has enough lubrication that is not a problem. But the oil is still not as protective as it is when the oil is hot. And so you do want to make sure that you're not putting high loads on the engine before the oil warms up a little bit.
Mm. So it's good not to gun your car anyway. So a lot of these things are kind of logical. You know, I've heard that you should drive your car at a steady pace, and that's good for safety-wise anyway, in terms of saving both energy and safety.
Well, and if you're driving around town, the thing that wastes the most gas is braking. If you can actually time it so that you're driving consistently and make lights instead of reining up them and braking, that saves both fuel and lowers the amount of pollutants as well.
Win-win.
Yes.
So what about hybrid vehicles? Do those have idling emissions like a Prius?
Well, I mean, the nice thing about hybrid vehicles is that they automatically shut off at idle. You don't have to turn the key off. The system will do it for you. So it is one of the advantages of the hybrid system.
But I have a Prius, and it'll still come on if I've got the air conditioning or the heater on, I think.
Yes. If the engine's cold, the engine does have to come on so that it can warm up the coolant. So you have the coolant that comes into the engine. But in the future, you'll see these systems become more sophisticated, where once the coolant's hot, the engine will shut off, and they'll use a coolant pump to keep circulating hot air. For air conditioning, they'll have electric air conditioning compressors that will run off the battery. Won't need to turn the engine on at idle. So
that'd be great.
The hybrid systems become more sophisticated in the future.
Are you talking about the stop-start thing that you mentioned in Europe?
Yeah, you can do stop-start independently of a hybrid system, just using it's still a 12-volt system. It has a better battery, but it's still a 12-volt battery. And all it does is stop the engine at idle and restart it. These systems are already becoming popular in Europe, and they're just starting to come to the U.S.
Takes a little getting used to. When I first got my Prius and it stopped, and the engine stopped when I was idling in traffic, I was like, oh my gosh, my car is broken down, but it was just fine.
Yeah, it's disconcerting. But once people get used to it, they like it.
Yeah, oh, I love it.
I mean, I used to work for Honda. One of the things you used to say about their hybrids is that no luxury car in the world can match the idle quality of a Civic hybrid.
Oh, yeah?
Because it's off.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard that, well, obviously motorcycles and mopeds get better gas mileage. How about the idling emissions? Are those better too?
Well, emissions in general, idling and on the road, are a problem. All motorcycles, no motorcycle has a catalyst. And catalysts on cars are over 99% efficient. Oh. So even though the engine out emissions from a motorcycle are lower, the tailpipe emissions are far higher than they are in a car. If you have an old moped with a two-stroke engine, those are awful. About 1/3 of the gasoline goes straight through the engine unburned. It's like taking 1/3 of the gasoline you get from the can and just pouring it on the ground.
Yikes. What about lawnmowers? I've heard they're kind of dirty.
Yeah, lawnmowers have been subject to some emission standards, which have cleaned them up somewhat, but they're still kind of in the motorcycle category.
It's a good thing to maybe get rid of your old lawnmower if it's really on there.
Yeah, actually, the newer mowers will have maybe 10 to 20% of the emissions of an old lawnmower.
Wow,
yeah, they're much
that's
cleaner.
a lot. And what about emergency vehicles? I've heard there's a concern with that.
Well, yeah, the concern with emergency vehicles is if you have somebody inside, you have to maintain all your support systems. Maybe in the future we'll see a situation in which emergency vehicles will be hybrids. We'll have battery packs that they can run this stuff off of. But until that day comes, they have to keep running. There's no question.
I saw a picture with some kind of vent that went from the hospital to the vehicle to help with the keeping comfort, and also a plug-in like a Tethers.
Right. One of the things that hospitals have found is that having emergency vehicles idling right outside of hospital rooms with patients who may have lung problems, it's really, really bad idea. And so some hospitals are progressively taking steps to provide the things that the emergency vehicles need so they don't have to idle right in the vicinity of the hospital.
And tethers, what are those?
If I understand properly, one of the things that happen is that truckers, when they will park for extended period of times, take a nap or sleep or whatever, you know, if it's cold outside or if it's hot outside, they keep the engine running, sometimes all night long, just so they can run their climate control systems inside the vehicle. And so what some rest stops are doing is that they're providing auxiliary electrical power so that they can plug in and can shut the engines off.
And to find out more about stuff like this, one of the things I found was that if I typed in U.S. Department of Energy Idling Reduction, I got a lot of good websites. So hopefully that will help. And
and one of the things, if you find out, is that there are 19 states that have already adopted anti-idling ordinances. A lot of them only apply to the heavy-duty trucks, not to everything. But still, the fact that areas like Nevada and Florida are way ahead of Ann Arbor on this issue is, to me, is kind of disconcerting.
Interesting. Well, I think we're out of time, unfortunately. But thank you so much for being here today. It's been great.
Thank you very much.
You'll find links relevant to the show at ewashina.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.